What do you do when everyone around you makes you feel that you're a bad person? My name is Renee Davidson. The first time I almost died, I was 4 years old. The second time, I was 7. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped counting. The hospital had a smell I knew better than our kitchen. Antiseptic and something floral they used to cover the antiseptic. Like someone had tried to make suffering more palatable and almost succeeded. Mom would sit beside my bed in the vinyl chair, the one that squeaked every time she shifted, and hold my hand until the breathing treatment kicked in. She'd bring her crossword puzzle book, the same one she always brought, though I never saw her complete more than half a puzzle. She'd sit there with her pen hovering and her eyes on the beeping monitor, pretending not to watch it. Third time this year? October. I was 12. Outside the window, other kids were doing whatever 12-year-olds did on Saturday afternoons in October. Riding bikes, raking leaves into piles and jumping in them, living inside their bodies like their bodies were something they could trust. I watched the ceiling tiles and breathed through a mask, and didn't think about any of that. I didn't feel guilty about being there, not yet. That came later. The nurses knew my name. Not from the chart. From memory. Hey Renee, back again? Let's get you sorted. The kind of warmth that comes from repeated exposure, from watching someone grow up one crisis at a time. They'd check my oxygen, adjust my nebulizer, ask about school. I'd answer in short sentences because long ones cost too much air. Mom would squeeze my hand. I thought that meant something. I was 12. I didn't know yet that love and need can look identical from the inside. My older sister Jenny was 14, Tashawn was 10, and while I was in that hospital room learning to breathe, they were home learning something else. That Mom's attention had a limit, and I was using most of it. The brisket and collard greens dinners reheated because Mom was at St. Luke's Hospital again, Dad retreating to the garage, to the television, to whatever internal room men like him go to when the world asks too much of them, the school pickups handled by neighbors, the bedtime routines abbreviated or forgotten, the ordinary machinery of family life grinding unevenly because one of its components kept breaking down. I understand it now. I do. They were kids. They didn't ask for a sister whose lungs staged a rebellion every few months. They didn't ask for a father who went quiet and distant every time the ambulance came, like each attack confirmed something he'd been dreading and didn't want to name out loud. They didn't ask to feel invisible in their own house. Children don't choose the families they're born into. None of us do. But understanding something and not being hurt by it, those are two very different things. The jealousy started as something I could feel but not see. A temperature change in a room when I walked into it. A slight narrowing of eyes. A certain way of not including me in things that was too consistent to be accidental. I told myself I was imagining it. I was 12. I needed to believe that. By the time I was 14, I wasn't imagining it anymore. The cruelty was never dramatic. That's the thing about family cruelty. It almost never is. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It just needs to be consistent. A board game getting suddenly boring the moment I walked into the room. We're kind of over it. Don't worry about it, they would say. A conversation stopping mid-sentence when I came downstairs. Not a pause. A full stop, like someone had cut the power. Laughter, quick, shared, between them, when I mentioned that a friend had turned on me. Not, oh no, what happened? Just laughter. Brief and bright, like I'd said something that confirmed a theory they'd already agreed on. I told my mother. It's all in your mind, Renee, she said. I told her again, more specifically, with examples. You're too sensitive. Your sisters love you. You've just been through a lot. I told her a third time, older now, 16, steadier on my feet, anger finally sharpening itself into something I could hold. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't name then. I can name it now. I've had years to name it. She looked relieved, like I'd given her permission to put something down she'd been holding for a while, like my accusation was the door she'd been waiting for. She didn't say you're wrong, Renee. She said, maybe if you tried harder to connect with them. Here's the thing, no one tells you about being the sick child. When you get better, you become inconvenient in a different way. By 17, the attacks were less frequent. I could go weeks, then months without one. My lungs were doing something they hadn't reliably done before, their job. I was sleeping through nights. I was running in gym class, not sprinting, never sprinting, but moving without stopping to grip my knees and wait. And somewhere in that recovery, something shifted in my mother. Quietly, incrementally. The way tides shift. You don't notice the waterline moving until you look back and the shore looks different. The attention she'd organized her identity around, the late-night hospital drives, the vigils in vinyl chairs, the way other mothers at church would look at her with that particular expression, heavy and admiring. "Oh, you poor dear, how do you manage?" That attention was drying up. I didn't have a name for what she'd been getting from it. I was too close to see it clearly. But I felt the change in her the way you feel weather before it arrives. She started agreeing with Jenny. Small things first. Jenny has a point, you know. Then bigger things. Then, eventually, the rewriting of history. The years she'd spent at my bedside reframed as years I'd stolen from the family. My illness recast as selfishness. My need for air recast as a performance. Tashawn followed Jenny's lead the way younger siblings do, instinctively, like a compass finding north. And I stood in the middle of my own family, feeling the ground shift beneath me and trying to understand what I'd done wrong. I was 19 the first time I decided I deserved all of it. That's the thing about being told something consistently enough. Eventually you stop waiting for proof. You just believe it. People-pleasing has a logic to it, a cold survival logic that makes complete sense when you're inside it. If you're always useful, no one can say you're a burden. If you give first, they can't take without asking. If you make yourself easy, agreeable, low maintenance, endlessly accommodating, maybe they'll decide you're worth keeping. I volunteered for everything, not because I wanted to, because I'd learned that wanting things was dangerous. Wanting things meant needing things, and needing things meant taking up space, and taking up space was what had caused all the trouble in the first place. So I cleaned more than my fair share. I worked a part-time job at the pharmacy on weekends so I'd have my own money, not for myself, but for gifts. A candle for a friend who was going through something. A scarf for Tashawn in a burgundy shade she'd mentioned once, briefly in passing, that she liked. She never wore it. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself she probably just forgot or was saving it, or it was the wrong shade of burgundy. I bought her another one the next Christmas. The friends I made, I now understand, were drawn to exactly what I was offering, someone who would give without being asked, someone who would apologize when she wasn't wrong, someone who could be relied on to smooth things over, to shrink when required, to take up less space so that others could take up more. I thought I was being a good friend. I was being a resource. There was the friend in high school who borrowed money I never got back and stopped returning my calls by summer. There was the one in my early college years who told my secrets to people I barely knew and then acted surprised when I was hurt. There was the boyfriend who needed someone steady and left when I stopped being quite so steady, when a bad month had me asking for something in return. The poor, sick little black girl, so easy to take advantage of her, to take her for granted. Each time I added it to the ledger. Another piece of evidence, another proof. See, this is what happens when you need things. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had built the most airtight case against myself you've ever seen. Exhibit after exhibit, year after year. A girl so thoroughly convinced of her own defectiveness that she'd stopped even looking for counter-evidence. I hadn't been able to start college full-time at 18 like everyone else. The attacks were too unpredictable, too disruptive. Missing 3 weeks of a semester wasn't a setback. It was a semester lost, so I'd taken part-time courses at the community college near home, 1 or 2 at a time, building slowly the way you build anything fragile, carefully with long pauses. By 27, I was healthy enough to go full-time. I enrolled as a sophomore, history major. I'd always loved history, the way it insisted on context, the way it said nothing happens without a reason and nothing happens alone. I found that comforting. My classmates were mostly 18, 19, 20. They had an ease about them I recognized as the ease of people who hadn't spent their formative years managing a chronic illness and an increasingly hostile family. I didn't resent them for it. I just noticed it, the way you notice weather you're not dressed for. I was older and quieter, and I sat near the back. I still brought gifts to people who didn't ask for them. Then in my junior year, when I was around 28, the attacks stopped. Not gradually, not with any announcement, just stopped. I stood in my apartment one Tuesday morning in March and breathed in, then out, then in again slowly, deeply, the kind of breath I had spent my whole life rationing, carefully, the way you ration something you're not sure you'll have enough of. Nothing tightened, nothing closed. I stood there for a long time in the morning, quiet, just breathing, like someone who'd finally been handed something they'd been waiting on for 28 years. And then I thought, I could go anywhere. I'd always wanted to see England, not the postcard version, not the tourist brochure version with the red telephone boxes and the palace guards. The real thing, the worn stone, the gray skies, the sense that time had layered itself into the soil and you were just walking on top of centuries. I'd read about Stonehenge as a child, lying in hospital beds with library books balanced on my knees. The standing stones on the Salisbury Plain, their purpose still debated, still not entirely known. Something about that had always gripped me, a thing built with enormous effort and intention, surviving 5,000 years and still keeping its secret. I'd read about Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, what remained of it after Henry VIII's dissolution of the Catholic Church, stripping it of its monks, its purpose, its Catholic devotion. The great arches still standing over the River Skell, the nave open to the sky now, grass growing between the stone floors, the whole place so ruined and so still and so completely itself that photographs of it made something in my chest pull tight. I'd read about the Royal Ballet at the Royal Opera House, the one at Covent Garden with the red velvet seats and the gold ceiling, the kind of beauty that doesn't apologize for being excessive. And I'd read about the food. London, specifically, the way it had become a city of 100 food cultures existing side by side, not blending exactly, but neighboring each other in a way that felt like proof of something important. Pink Afghani tea, sweet and cardamom fragrant, and that startling rose color. Georgian khachapuri, the bread boat open and filled with melted cheese and a soft egg pooled in the center. The kind of dish so simple it felt almost accidental, and so perfect it clearly wasn't. Jamaican patties from Brixton Market, the pastry golden and flaky, the spiced beef inside hitting differently when you ate it where it belonged, surrounded by the noise and color of a Saturday market. I applied for the UK Study Abroad program in October. I didn't tell my family until I'd been accepted. I knew what they'd say. I'd spent enough years anticipating exactly what they'd say. When I told my mother, she was quiet for a moment. "You're going to run away to England. I'm going to study abroad," I said. "It's a program. It counts toward my degree." England, like I'd said Mars, I've always wanted to go. She made a sound I recognized. The sound that meant she disagreed but was going to file it under "this" is what Renee does rather than engage with it directly. Jenny said of course she is to Tashan, in a voice meant for me to hear. I booked the flight that evening. I arrived at Heathrow on a January morning, tired and slightly wrinkled from the overnight flight, dragging a suitcase that was slightly too heavy because I'd packed for every version of England I'd imagined. The air outside the terminal was cold and damp and smelled like diesel and rain. I stood on the pavement for a moment with my suitcase and my carry-on and my folder of housing information, and I looked at the gray sky and the gray road and the ordinary airport infrastructure of it all, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not joy, exactly. Not yet. Just space. Enormous, quiet, anonymous space. No one here knew my name. No one here knew about the hospital visits, the sisters, the board games that stopped, the conversations that died when I walked in. No one here had a story about me already written before I opened my mouth. I was just a person, getting into a taxi, going somewhere. The cab driver asked where I was headed. I gave him the address. He made a comment about the traffic on the M4. I said something agreeable. He turned the radio on low. We drove into the city, and I watched it appear outside the window, the suburban sprawl thinning into something denser, older, The buildings pressing closer together, the streets narrowing, a church spire here, a red bus there, the Thames River suddenly visible between buildings and then gone again. I thought, I'm here. I thought, no one knows me here. I let that sit for a while. It felt like breathing deeply. I want to tell you about the food because it matters more than it might sound like it matters. When you grow up managing a chronic illness, your relationship with pleasure gets complicated. Everything becomes slightly conditional. You learn to hold good things loosely because good things can be interrupted. You learn not to want too much because wanting too much has costs. Food had always been the exception. Even in hospital beds, even at my worst, I could read about food with a kind of uncomplicated longing. It didn't require anything from my lungs. It just required imagination. So London's food became the first place I let myself want things fully. The pink Afghani tea I found in a small cafe in Mayfair, recommended by a classmate who'd been there the previous semester. I'd looked it up beforehand, the way I did everything. Researched, prepared, trying to make sure I didn't seem like someone who didn't know what she was doing. But reading about it and sitting in that small, warm room with the cup in my hands were entirely different things. The color of it first, that deep pale pink that doesn't look like any tea you've seen before. Then the smell, milky and fragrant, cardamom and something floral underneath. Then the taste, sweet and warm and slightly smoky and nothing like anything I could compare it to. I drank it slowly. I didn't check my phone. The Georgian khachapuri came a few weeks later. A small restaurant in Soho, 12 tables, a hand-lettered menu on a chalkboard. I ordered it because I'd read about it, but I wasn't prepared for what arrived. A boat of bread, slightly crisp at the edges, soft in the center, filled with molten cheese and a bright egg, a knob of butter slowly melting in the heat of it. The server told me to mix the yolk through the cheese before tearing the bread to dip. I did. I ate it too fast and didn't care. The Jamaican patties in Brixton happened on a Saturday morning when I'd taken the tube south without a plan, just to walk somewhere I hadn't been. The market was loud and colorful and smelled of plantain frying and spices I didn't have names for. I stood in a short line and ordered a beef patty from a man who handed it to me in a paper bag without commentary and went immediately to the next customer. I ate it standing up, slightly off to the side of the foot traffic, the pastry hot and flaking, the fillings spiced and deep, the whole thing gone in about 4 minutes. I thought about buying another one. I did. This is the kind of small decision that matters more than it sounds. Buying the second thing, not rationing the pleasure, not making myself earn it, just eating the second patty because I wanted it. The Royal Ballet was in February. Swan Lake. I'd booked the ticket in November before I'd even confirmed my housing, because some things you make certain of before anything else. I wore the nicest thing I'd brought, a dark blue dress that I'd bought specifically for this and told no one about because I knew how it would land. Of course Renee bought a dress for the ballet. She thinks she's so special, the way they said of course about everything, like knowing me in advance. The Royal Opera House at Covent Garden is the kind of building that makes you understand why humans build beautiful things. The red velvet, the gold ceiling, the scale of it. Not intimidating, but generous. Like it was built to make you feel that beauty was your birthright, rather than something you had to justify. The lights went down, the orchestra tuned, then silence, then music. I am not going to try to describe what it looked like when the dancers came on stage because I don't think I can do it accurately and I don't want to do it badly. I'll just say this. I sat in my red velvet seat in my dark blue dress in a city where no one knew me, and I watched Swan Lake at the Royal Opera House, and I cried quietly for about 20 minutes in the second act without entirely understanding why. Not sadness, something else. Something like being fully present in a life you're actually living rather than one you're surviving. Stonehenge came in March on a coach trip organized by the university. The plain in winter was brown and flat, and the sky was enormous and white-gray, and the stones were smaller than I'd expected from photographs and more powerful than I'd expected from anything. I stood as close as the path allowed and looked at them for a long time without taking a picture. There would be time for pictures. First, I just wanted to stand there and let 5,000 years of human effort and intention do whatever it was going to do. It did something. I'm still not sure what. Fountains Abbey I saved for last. I took the train to York alone on a Saturday in April, then a bus to Studley Royal, then walked down through the Water Garden to the valley where the ruins stood. Nothing I'd read had prepared me for the scale of them. The nave of the Abbey Church, roofless now, open to the grey Yorkshire sky, the great arches of the windows still intact after 800 years of weather, grass growing through the stone floor, where monks had walked for 4 centuries before Henry VIII's commissioners came with their inventory lists and their orders. The river running nearby, quiet and steady, like it had been there before any of this and intended to outlast it. I walked slowly through the ruins. I didn't have a tour guide. I didn't need one. I'd read enough. I thought about things surviving their own destruction. I thought about myself at 12, in the hospital, in the vinyl chair's shadow. I thought about how much of what I'd survived hadn't been the asthma at all. I sat on a low wall for a while with my hands in my jacket pockets and listened to the wind moving through the arches. A thing can be stripped bare, I thought, and still know what it is. I didn't cry. Something quieter than crying happened instead. Amelia found me first. She was in my British history seminar, second week of term, already occupying her seat with the confidence of someone who had decided where she belonged and felt no need to justify it. She had a stack of annotated books and the particular sharp attention of a person who is genuinely interested in the thing being discussed rather than just being seen to be interested. She disagreed with the professor about something in the third week, calmly, specifically, with citations. I liked her immediately and did nothing about it for 2 weeks because that was my pattern. Admire from a careful distance, wait to be invited, never assume you're welcome. Then she sat down next to me in the library one afternoon and said, without any preamble, "You're the one who made the point about the Corn Laws last Thursday." That was good. "I'm Amelia." I told her my name. She nodded like she'd already looked me up. "American?" "Yes. Studying here for the semester?" "Year." "Good," she said, opening her laptop. "The semester ones never settle in properly." That was it. That was the beginning. Amelia was very British. Direct to the point of occasional bluntness, privately warmer than she appeared, constitutionally allergic to sentimentality but deeply loyal in practice. She'd grown up in Bristol. She read widely and had opinions about everything and stated them without apology, which I found both alarming and deeply refreshing. She was also, I would come to understand, the kind of person who paid close attention to the people around her even when she seemed distracted. Cindy came through Amelia about 3 weeks in, at a pub near the campus where Amelia had invited me for what she called just a few of us, not a thing. Don't make it a thing. Cindy was British Ghanaian, raised in Peckham, a graphic designer doing freelance work alongside her master's degree in visual communication. She arrived 20 minutes late without apology, ordered a drink, and immediately said something that made the whole table laugh. A story about a client she'd had that week, delivered with such perfect timing and such precise detail that even I, who knew none of the people involved, was laughing genuinely. She had a laugh herself that filled the room rather than cracking it. The kind of laugh that made other people realize they'd been laughing quietly and now wanted to do it properly. I liked her in the immediate, uncomplicated way you sometimes like a person before you've had time to get in your own way about it. Then I went home that evening and immediately began cataloging all the ways it would probably fall apart. I saw what I was doing. That's the thing. I was old enough and had thought about myself enough to see the pattern while I was inside it. Seeing it didn't stop it, but I could watch myself do it, which was something. I anticipated what Amelia and Cindy would need before they said anything. I showed up having already thought through potential problems. If we were planning to go somewhere, I'd researched the best route, the opening hours, the backup option if the first thing didn't work out. I brought things to group study sessions that no one had asked for. I remembered details they'd mentioned in passing and referenced them later, not to be impressive, but because I'd been paying close attention in the way you pay attention when you're not sure you're welcome and you're trying to build a case for your own presence. I thought I was being a good friend. I know now I was still trying to make myself useful before anyone could decide I wasn't worth keeping. The conversation happened on an evening in March, in Amelia's flat in Hackney, the three of us on the floor with takeaway containers between us and something low volume on the television that none of us were really watching. I'd done it again. Arrived early to help set up a dinner that didn't require setting up, brought things, smoothed things, anticipated things. Amelia set down her fork. She looked at Cindy. Cindy looked at her. The look said, "Now." "Renee," Amelia said, "we want to say something and we need you to actually hear it, rather than immediately finding a way to be fine with it." I sat up slightly. The familiar preparation, the bracing, the waiting for the verdict. "You don't have to do all of that," she said. "The organizing, the bringing things, the anticipating. You do it constantly. We've noticed. We know," Cindy said, not unkindly, "but you don't have to. We're not going to disappear if you stop." A pause. "You're enough," Amelia said. "Just sitting here. You being here is enough. We don't need anything else from you. We just want you." I smiled. I said thank you. I changed the subject, gently, gracefully, the way I'd learned to move away from things that were too close. But something had happened. Something had been said out loud in a room and couldn't be unsaid. I walked home that night. It was about 40 minutes on foot, longer than it needed to be, but the night was clear and cold, and I needed the time. I walked across a bridge over the Thames. The city reflected in the water below, broken and reassembled by the movement of the river, lights and their doubles. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and stood there. "You're enough." I'd heard variations of that sentiment before, in books and in the kind of well-meaning advice people give each other. I'd even believed it abstractly, the way you believe something in theory that you haven't yet been able to integrate into actual daily life. But hearing it said plainly, in a real room, by people who had no reason to say it except that they meant it, that landed differently. I thought about my mother in the vinyl chair. I thought about Jenny's face when she didn't realize I was looking. I thought about 12 years old and needing air. I thought about all the gifts I'd bought that no one had asked for, all the space I'd shrunk out of before I was asked to shrink, all the ways I'd made myself smaller and more convenient and less likely to be a problem. The river moved underneath the bridge. London hummed around me in its enormous, ordinary way, completely indifferent, which was exactly what I needed. I didn't cry on that bridge, but something loosened, the way ice does. Not all at once, at the edges, quietly, in its own time. It didn't change overnight. I want to be honest about that because I'm tired of stories where the turning point turns everything at once. Real things move slowly. Real things move the way river water moves around stone, persistently, incrementally, until one day you look up and the stone is different. But things did change. I stopped over-apologizing in seminar, not all at once, but I started noticing when I was about to apologize for having an opinion, and sometimes I managed to have the opinion without the apology first. I ordered what I actually wanted in restaurants instead of what seemed least inconvenient, least likely to be difficult, least likely to require anything extra from anyone. I let Amelia help me move a bookshelf in my flat without offering to buy her dinner 3 times first. I told Cindy that I hadn't liked a film she'd recommended and expected something to shift in her expression, and it didn't. "What didn't you like about it?" she asked. So I told her, and she disagreed with me. And we had a conversation. No damage, no fallout, no aftermath, just 2 people with different opinions about a film. I walked home from that afternoon thinking, is this what it's supposed to feel like? I've already told you about going to Fountains Abbey, but there's something I didn't include. I sat on that low stone wall for a long time after I'd walked through the ruins. The wind through the arches, the river below. The sky that particular pale gray that Yorkshire does so well, like light filtered through old linen. I took out my phone, not to take a picture, to write something down. I keep notes the way some people keep diaries, not consistently, not neatly, just when something needs to be caught before it disappears. I typed, "The Abbey survived being stripped, still standing, still itself. What is still itself about me?" I looked at that for a while. Then I wrote, "I still love history. I still love the feeling of entering a city I've never been in before. I still laugh at things that aren't that funny if you say them flat, but are very funny if you say them right. I still want to understand why things happened the way they did. I am still here. I put my phone away. The stone wall was cold through my jacket. I didn't move. After a while, a family walked past. 2 parents, a small child who was running slightly ahead of them. That full-body commitment to forward movement that small children have, arms out, not quite steady, entirely convinced. The parents were keeping pace without interfering, letting the child run. I watched them until they disappeared around the corner. You were never the problem, I thought. Not as an argument, not as reassurance, just as a fact. You were never the problem. Things I understood by the time the year was halfway through. That I had been sick, not performing, not dramatic, sick. My lungs had not worked reliably for most of my life, and that was not a character flaw, and it was not a choice. That my mother had needed something from my illness that had nothing to do with me. That she had needed to be needed in a particular way, and when that need dissolved, she'd found a different story to tell. Not because she was a monster, because she was a person who didn't know herself well enough to recognize what she was doing. That Jenny and Tashawn had been hurt too, by a family system that had no room to account for everyone's needs at once. That their hurt was real, that their cruelty had also been real, that both of these could be true simultaneously without canceling each other out. That I had spent approximately 20 years building a case for my own unworthiness, using evidence that, examined carefully, didn't actually prove what I thought it proved. That Amelia and Cindy were real, that this was what friendship was supposed to feel like, not a transaction, not a performance, not something you had to earn with constant usefulness. That the City of London had given me something I hadn't known I needed until I had it. Not escape exactly, more like negative space, room to see my own outline without all the familiar furniture in the way. By the time the summer came, I didn't want to leave. London's weather and lack of sun was not the greatest for a brown girl like me, but I loved being here. That surprised me. I'd expected to miss home, even the complicated version of home I had, the way you can miss a thing that has hurt you because it's still yours. But I didn't miss it the way I'd expected. What I missed occasionally was the idea of home, the theoretical version, the one where families were straightforward about love. I had a conversation with my mother before I left, not a confrontation. I wasn't ready for that, and I'm not sure I'll ever need it. But a conversation where I said, calmly and without anger, I know things were hard. I know having me sick put pressure on everyone. I'm not angry. But I also want you to know that it wasn't my fault, and I've spent a long time believing it was, and I'm working on stopping that. She was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said, I know I wasn't always fair to you, Renee. That was all. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't resolution, but it was acknowledgement, and I hadn't had that before, and I took it for what it was, a small, imperfect, human thing. I went to see Amelia and Cindy the night before my flight. We sat in Amelia's flat again, in the same places we'd settled into over the year, the floor, the sofa cushions, the window seat that was technically decorative but had become Cindy's. I told them what they'd given me without meaning to. The conversation, the you're enough, the ordinary constancy of 2 people who just kept showing up without requiring anything in return. Cindy cried. She would deny this. It happened. Amelia said, You're going to be fine, you know. You're already fine. I said, I know. And I did. I'm 30 now. Back home, finishing my degree, starting the slow work of figuring out what comes next. The apartment I have is small and mine. I chose everything in it, not to prove a point, not because I was keeping receipts, just because I finally understand that the things you surround yourself with matter, and you're allowed to care about that. My relationship with my family is what it is. Jenny and I speak occasionally. Tashawn sent me a message about something she'd seen online once, something she thought I'd like, and I texted back, and we had a brief and ordinary exchange. My mother calls sometimes, and we talk about surface things, and occasionally something truer passes through, and neither of us addresses it directly, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the most honest version of what we have. I've stopped needing them to be different. The asthma attacks haven't come back. Sometimes I forget, going through an ordinary morning, that I spent so many years of my life not being able to do this. Just breathing. Just being in a body that cooperates. I forget, and then I remember, and for a moment I feel something that isn't quite gratitude and isn't quite grief. Something in between, an awareness of what was, a quiet acknowledgement that I'm still here. The special plug-in electric kettle that I bought to remind me of London that's on my counter, the one I saved up for, the one that belongs entirely to me. I use it every morning. The steam rises while I wait. I'm not in a hurry. The day I stopped counting how many times I'd almost died. The day I stopped apologizing for having needed something to breathe. The day I stopped filling the space my family left with gifts nobody asked for. The day I stopped building cases against myself with evidence that was never actually mine to carry. The day I stood in the ruins of Fountains Abbey and understood that a thing can be stripped to its arches and still be standing. The day two people said you're enough and meant it so plainly that I almost couldn't receive it. That was the day I finally could. Outside, the city moves. Ordinary and enormous. Completely indifferent. I lean against the counter and let the steam rise. Some mornings, just breathing is everything. This morning, it's enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.